cop orders a police dog to bite a black boy in the park, assuming there will be no consequences. But everything changes when the boy's father, a police captain, steps in and demands justice. Subscribe now so you don't miss what happens next. Where are you watching from? The sun climbed gently. Over the horizon, bathing the sprawling park in golden light, a cool breeze stirred the leaves on the oak trees, and the soft hum of distant conversation filled the air. Families gathered on picnic blankets, joggers weaved along the trails, and children's laughter echoed from the playground. It was a peaceful morning, with the scent of freshly cut grass in the air, promising an idyllic start to the day. Rachel Gibbs, however, did not share in the morning's tranquility. Dressed in her crisp police uniform, she strolled along a winding path, RPP in the leash of her German shepherd, Thor. The dog's dark coat gleamed under the sunlight and his ears twitched, alert to every sound and movement around them. Rachel found solace in Thor's presence. He embodied order, control, and obedience, the very qualities she prided herself on as a police officer. But as she observed the world around her, her mind buzzed with a sense of detachment, even disdain, for the couples enjoying their morning strolls, the parents playing with their children. All of it irritated her. They don't know what it's like to be out here every day, she thought, keeping people in line, making sure the city stays in order. Her gaze shifted to a small boy running along the grassy hill nearby. A young black child no older than 6 chased after a toy airplane, laughing as he stumbled in the grass. Joy seemed to gnaw at something deep within Rachel. She stopped in her tracks, her jaw tightening. "What's he doing here?" she muttered under her breath. Thor sensed the change in her mood, his ears perking up as he eyed the boy curiously. Rachel's hand tightened around the leash as a thought took root in her mind, a thought she didn't bother questioning. He doesn't belong here. The boy's carefree presence in the park, the way he moved without fear, grated against her instinct to impose control. She gave Thor a gentle tug. "Let's go," she whispered, her tone low and deliberate. Thor let out a soft growl, his muscles tensing in anticipation. The boy, unaware of the storm brewing, continued playing. He chased his toy down the hill, giggling as it tumbled further from his grasp. Suddenly he tripped and fell to his knees, scraping them slightly, but he was too preoccupied with his toy to notice. Rachel watched intently, her heart throbbing with an odd sense of satisfaction. "All right." "Thor," she muttered, "go," before she could second-guess her decision. "Thor, Thor, boar. Thor, Thor," she muttered. "Glass." Before she could second-guess her decision, Rachel released Thor's leash. The dog darted forward like a bolt of lightning, charging toward the unsuspecting boy. The German shepherd's powerful legs propelled him across the field in a blur of motion, his teeth bared, his bark sharp and loud. The boy froze, his toy airplane falling from his hand as fear paralyzed him. His eyes widened, and he opened his mouth to scream, but the sound got caught in his throat. The shepherd reached him within seconds, knocking him flat onto the ground. The boy's small body hit the grass with a thud, and Thor's paws pinned him down, growling fiercely, inches from his face. "Help!" the boy finally managed to cry out, his voice cracking with terror. Rachel stood at a distance, watching with a cold detachment. She didn't move to intervene. A little scare will teach him, she thought. Her pulse quickened, but not from concern. There was a twisted satisfaction in watching the boy squirm beneath Thor's weight. The dog barked loudly, saliva dripping from its fangs as it loomed over the boy, who now sobbed uncontrollably. People nearby started noticing the commotion. A woman on a nearby bench gasped, clutching her child closer. A jogger stopped mid-stride, pulling out their phone to film the scene. The murmurs grew louder, and a small crowd began to gather, whispering and pointing at the boy trapped under the imposing dog. "Somebody help him!" an onlooker shouted. But Rachel remained rooted to her spot, unmoved. The boy's cries grew more frantic, tears streaking down his cheeks as he desperately called out for help. "Daddy! Daddy! Help!" Then, from the far end of the park, a tall figure appeared, moving swiftly through the crowd. It was Michael Harper, the boy's father and captain of the local police department. He had been out for a morning run when he heard the unmistakable bark of a police dog, followed by the sound of his son's voice filled with fear. Daniel Michael's booming voice cut through the chaos like a whip. Rachel stiffened as she recognized him instantly. Her grip on Thor's leash faltered, but it was too late. Michael was already storming toward them, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "Get that dog off my son!" Michael roared, his voice shaking with rage. Thor's bark subsided, and the dog instinctively looked toward Rachel, awaiting her command. But Rachel, frozen under the weight of Michael's glare, hesitated. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Michael knelt beside Daniel and pulled his son into his arms. The boy clung to him tightly, still sobbing, his tiny hands gripping his father's running shirt. Michael's heart pounded as he checked Daniel over, brushing the tears from the boy's face. Rachel, finally regaining her composure, tried to justify her actions. "He was Michael." He cut her off with a fierce look. "Save it," he snapped. "You think it's okay to sick a dog on a child? On my child?" Rachel squared her shoulders, attempting to maintain her authority. "I was doing my job," she said coolly, though her voice wavered slightly. "He was acting suspicious." Michael's voice dripped with disbelief. "He's 6 years old, for God's sake." The crowd grew and phones recorded every second of the encounter. Parents glared at Rachel, some muttering under their breath about the unnecessary use of force. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with outrage and indignation. Thor whined softly, sensing the unease between the humans. Rachel gave a sharp tug on his leash, pulling the dog back to her side, but the damage was already done. Michael Harper's eyes were locked onto hers, and there was no mistaking the fury in them. "You don't get to walk away from this," Michael warned, his voice low and steady, though his rage simmered just beneath the surface. Rachel folded her arms, her expression defiant. "I was following protocol," Michael scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "My protocol? If this is your idea of protocol, you've got no business wearing that badge." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. Some of them shouted at Rachel to apologize. While others demanded accountability, Rachel's hands trembled slightly, but she masked her unease with a stern expression as Michael stood cradling Daniel in his arms. He leaned closer to Rachel, his voice barely above a whisper, but laced with steel. "You'll be hearing from me, Officer Gibbs, and I promise you this isn't over. Rachel watched him go, her pulse racing. She knew exactly who Michael Harper was, and now she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. The park had fallen into an eerie silence after the incident with Thor the German Shepherd. The once peaceful air was now thick with tension as Captain Michael Harper carried his son Daniel in his arms. The little boy clung to his father, his small body trembling, his cries muffled against Michael's chest. His scraped knees were visible, and the fear that radiated from him only fueled the fury boiling inside his father. Rachel Gibbs stood rooted to her spot, her posture rigid, trying to maintain a semblance of control. Her mind raced, a mixture of disbelief and irritation at how quickly the situation had spiraled. She had faced confrontation before, but nothing like this. Her heart pounded as Michael turned back toward her, his face a storm of anger and disbelief. Michael's eyes bore into her fiercely and unrelentingly. "You think you can just walk away from this?" His voice was low, but the underlying threat in his words was unmistakable. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to suppress her growing panic. "Captain Harper, I don't know you." "You, Captain Harper, me," Michael cut her off with his voice. Rising as he stepped forward, "You attacked my son. You set your dog on him like he was a criminal. He's a child." His words struck like a hammer, leaving no room for Rachel to hide behind her authority. She stiffened, trying to salvage what little control she had left. "He was behaving suspiciously," she repeated, though now her words lacked the certainty they held before. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. "Suspicious? He's 6 years old." His voice boomed across the park, drawing even more attention from bystanders who had gathered, phones raised recording every word, every movement. "You see a black child and that's your first thought, isn't it? He's suspicious." Rachel's face flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words seemed to fail her. "That's not," she stammered, but Michael wasn't listening. His fury was too intense, too raw. "Do you even know who I am?" Michael demanded, his voice still seething but now controlled. "You work for me. I'm your captain and I will not let this slide." Rachel's pulse quickened. She had known Michael Harper for years, but always from a distance. He had a reputation for being a fair and dedicated leader, well respected by the department. But she never imagined she would find herself on the receiving end of his wrath. Worse still, the realization dawned on her that her actions today had crossed a line that could destroy her career. But she couldn't afford to show weakness, now not in front of all these people. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. "I was doing my job," she insisted, though her voice lacked the conviction it once held. "I was ensuring the safety of the park. The boy was alone, acting erratically, and I followed protocol." "Protocol." Michael repeated the word like it was poison on his tongue. Your protocol is to attack children now, to unleash a dog on a 6-year-old without even assessing the situation." He shook his head in disbelief. "You think you're above the law, don't you, because you wear that uniform?" Rachel's composure faltered. The cracks began to show. The crowd was growing, and the murmur of voices around them only intensified her anxiety. She glanced around, catching sight of the many phones pointed in their direction, recording every second. Her colleagues would see this, her superiors would see this, and soon enough the entire city would know what happened in the park today. Before she could respond, Michael's attention shifted back to Daniel, who was still clutching his father's shirt, his body shaking with soft sobs. Michael knelt down, pulling his son closer. "Are you okay, buddy?" he asked gently, brushing his fingers through Daniel's hair. "Did the dog hurt you?" Daniel shook his head, though his face was still pale with fear. "I was just playing, Daddy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong." Michael's heart clenched at the sound of his son's words. He kissed Daniel's forehead and stood back up, his gaze hardening as it returned to Rachel. "This ends now," he said quietly, but with a deadly seriousness that Rachel couldn't ignore. "You will be held accountable for this, Gibbs." Rachel swallowed her throat dry. She could feel the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing in on her, their stares like daggers in her back. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she scrambled to find a response, anything that might salvage the situation. But before she could speak, one of the onlookers stepped forward. "That's right, she should be arrested." A voice rang out from the crowd, a man standing with his phone raised high. "You can't just attack a kid and get away with it." More voices joined in, some calling for Rachel's resignation, others demanding that she apologize. The crowd's anger was palpable, and it was clear that they were on Michael's side. Rachel's chest tightened as she glanced at the phones recording every second. The situation was slipping out of her control faster than she could have imagined. She forced herself to take a step forward, her voice quieter now but still trying to maintain some semblance of authority. "Captain, I didn't mean for this to happen. It was a misunderstanding." Michael's gaze hardened. His patience was clearly wearing thin. "A misunderstanding. My son could have been seriously hurt if I hadn't been here." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but just then a man in the crowd stepped forward. "I got everything on camera," he said, holding up his phone for Michael to see. "You should take this to internal affairs. This is police brutality, plain and simple." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Rachel's stomach dropped. Internal affairs, if this went to IIA, it would mean a full investigation, and with the video evidence circulating, her career could very well be over. Michael turned to the man with the phone and gave a curt nod. "Thank you," he said, his voice calm but strained. Then he looked back at Rachel. "You will be investigated for this, Gibbs, and trust me, there will be consequences." Rachel's mind raced. The reality of the situation crashed down on her. She had made a grave mistake. She had underestimated Michael Harper and the public's reaction. What she had thought would be the act of maintaining control, had turned into a nightmare, and now there was no turning back. Michael gave her one final look, his expression filled with both disappointment and determination. "I'll be filing a report with IIA today," he said. "I suggest you get a lawyer." With that, he turned and walked away, carrying Daniel in his arms. The crowd parted for him, and as he passed, people murmured words of encouragement, offering their support. Rachel stood frozen in place, her mind still reeling from the encounter, her heart pounding in her chest as Michael disappeared from view. The reality of what had just happened hit Rachel like a tidal wave. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for was now hanging by a thread. She glanced down at Thor, who sat obediently by her side, unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. Rachel let out a shaky breath, feeling the eyes of the crowd still on her. Her body felt heavy with the weight of her mistake, and as she stood there surrounded by judgment, she knew that the worst was yet to come. Michael Harper sat in his office, a heavy silence settling over him. The anger from the park incident still lingered, but now it was focused into a determined resolve. The image of his terrified son lying helpless beneath Thor's weight haunted his thoughts, fueling his decision to act as captain. He had the authority to open an internal investigation, and that was exactly what he intended to do, no matter the cost. He took a deep breath and pulled out the necessary paperwork, his fingers moving methodically over the keyboard as he drafted the complaint. It was straightforward. An official accusation of misconduct against Officer Rachel Gibbs for the unjustified use of force and negligence. The report included detailed descriptions of the incident, along with references to the video evidence captured by bystanders as the words filled the screen. A knock at the door pulled Michael from his thoughts. He glanced up to see one of his fellow officers, Detective Simmons, standing in the doorway. Simmons was a seasoned officer older than Michael, with a reputation for knowing which battles to fight and which to avoid. "Are you really going through with this, Mike?" Simmons asked, his tone a mixture of curiosity and concern. Michael leaned back in his chair. Crossing his arms, "I don't have a choice," he replied evenly. "What she did was wrong." Simmons stepped further into the office, closing the door behind him. "Look, I get it," he said cautiously, "but this is going to stir things up. Gibbs has connections. Powerful ones. Some folks in the department aren't going to like you going after her." Michael's jaw tightened. "I don't care who her friends are. My son was attacked, Simmons, by one of our own. There's no sweeping this under the rug." Simmons sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just hope you know what you're getting into. This could get ugly fast." Michael gave a short nod and let Simmons leave the office. Michael stared at the report on his screen for a moment longer before hitting submit. The gears were now in motion, and there was no turning back. The complaint would go straight to Internal Affairs, triggering a formal investigation that would force the department to confront one of its own. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Our videos from the park had gone viral, making their way across social media platforms and news outlets. Hashtags calling for accountability gained traction, and the public was quick to voice its outrage. Headlines splashed across screens. "Officer sets police dog on child. Father seeks justice." "Police captain's son attacked by fellow officers." K9. The public response was overwhelming. Local activists organized protests outside the police station, demanding an immediate suspension of Officer Gibbs' comment sections, filled with anger, with some people sharing their own stories of police misconduct. Others questioned whether Gibbs had acted out of racial bias, intensifying the scrutiny around the case. Otherwise, the department found itself under increasing pressure to respond. The chief called for an emergency meeting, and Michael knew the investigation was going to meet resistance, not just from Gibbs, but from the very people he worked with every day. Later that afternoon, Michael sat in the conference room with his fellow officers. The atmosphere was tense, thick with unspoken resentment across the table. Rachel Gibbs sat with her arms folded, flanked by two senior officers who were visibly uncomfortable with the situation. The chief, a stern-faced man named Wallace, opened the meeting with a curt nod toward Michael. "Captain Harper, I understand you filed a formal complaint against Officer Gibbs." Michael met the chief's gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. Her actions were unjustified, and there needs to be accountability." Wallace sighed, leaning back in his chair. "We're already getting heat from the media, and the public is demanding answers, but I need to know. Are you sure this is the right move? We've got to think about the department's reputation." Michael's temper flared, though he kept his voice steady. "This isn't about the department's reputation. It's about doing what's right." One of the senior officers chimed in, his voice edged with frustration. "Gibbs has been with us for years. She's a good cop. Are we really going to throw her under the bus for a misunderstanding?" Michael turned to face him, his expression hard. A good cop doesn't unleash a dog on a child. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was negligence. Gibbs, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke up. "I was following protocol, Captain." Her voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "I didn't mean any harm." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Intent doesn't excuse what happened. My son could have been seriously injured." The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment no one spoke. Wallace cleared his throat, signaling the end of the discussion. "The investigation will proceed as required," he said, though his tone suggested that he wasn't thrilled about it. "But I suggest we all tread carefully. This department can't afford another scandal." As the meeting adjourned, Michael stood to leave, but Gibbs shot him a cold glance. "You're making a mistake. Harper," she said quietly, "this won't end the way you think it will." Michael didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the room, his resolve hardening with each step. At home, the tension weighed heavy on Michael and his family. His wife, Angela, sat at the kitchen table with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of concern and frustration. "You know they're going to come after you, right?" she said, her voice low but firm. "They're going to make this about you, not Gibbs." Michael leaned against the counter, rubbing his temples. "I don't care what they do. This isn't about me. It's about Daniel. What she did was wrong, and she needs to be held accountable." Angela sighed, her gaze softening as she glanced toward their son, who was curled up on the couch clutching a stuffed animal. "Daniel hasn't been the same since it happened," she whispered. "He won't even go outside to play." Michael's heart ached at the sight of his son, so small and vulnerable. He knew that pursuing the investigation would come at a cost, not just to him but to his family as well. But the thought of letting Gibbs walk away without consequences was unbearable. "We'll get through this," he said, crossing the room to sit beside Angela. "I have to do this for him, for all the kids who've been treated like this." Angela gave a small nod, though worry still clouded her eyes. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I can't lose you over this." Michael kissed her forehead, his voice soft but resolute. "I promise." The investigation had officially begun, and the public was watching closely. Michael knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with resistance and backlash. But as he glanced at his son, sleeping peacefully on the couch, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter what it took, he would see this through. Justice had to be served, and this time there would be no sweeping the truth under the rug. Rachel Gibbs sat at the edge of her bed, her mind spinning. She gripped her phone, scrolling through the countless messages from fellow officers. Some were sympathetic, others bluntly dismissive. Most urged her to keep her head down until the investigation blew over. But Rachel knew better. This wasn't going to blow over. Michael Harper had made sure of that. Her anxiety morphed into anger as she tossed the phone onto her bedside table. This wasn't just about her career anymore. Harper's complaint was threatening to unravel everything she had built. If she lost her badge, what was left? The bitterness gnawed at her, and the fact that Harper outranked her only made it worse. "He thinks he can ruin me," she thought bitterly, her fists clenching, determined not to let him win. Rachel pulled on her uniform and headed to the precinct. She needed allies. The only way to fight Harper was from the inside. The atmosphere at the station was tense. Officers whispered as she passed, their eyes flickering with suspicion. Some of them she knew were waiting to see if she'd be taken down. Others avoided her entirely, knowing full well that her downfall could drag them into the mud. In the locker room, she found Detective Simmons leaning against a bench, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up as she entered and gave a small nod, still breathing. "Ha," he muttered, trying to. Rachel replied with a smirk, though it didn't reach her eyes. She sat down across from him, rubbing her temples. "I need help. Simmons Harper's out for blood, and if I don't fight back, I'm finished." Simmons raised an eyebrow. "You poked the wrong bear. Rachel Harper's not the kind of guy to back down." "That's why I need leverage," she said quietly, something to make him think twice before dragging me down with him. Simmons hesitated, glancing around the empty room before leaning in closer. "Be careful," he warned. "People are already talking. You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Rachel exhaled sharply, her frustration mounting. It was already worse as she left the station. Her thoughts raced. She knew she had to act fast. If Harper wanted to fight, he was going to get one. Meanwhile, at home, Michael Harper sat across from his wife at the dining table, exhaustion weighing heavily on him. Angela's face was lined with concern, her hands folded tightly in front of her. "How long do you think this is going to drag on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "As long as it takes," Michael replied. He glanced towards the living room, where Daniel sat quietly with a book, his eyes downcast. A lively, playful child he once knew had been replaced by a quiet shadow of himself. "He's scared," Angela said softly. "He hasn't slept properly since it happened, and now you're getting pulled deeper into this mess at work." Michael rubbed his hands over his face, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "I know," he said, "but I can't back down now. If I let this slide, what kind of message does that send to him, or to the other kids who look like him?" Angela's eyes softened. "I just don't want this to break you, Michael. You've been fighting your whole life, and I know you'll fight this too, but be careful, please." Michael nodded slowly. "I'll be careful, but I need to see this through." As they sat in silence, the phone buzzed on the table. Michael glanced at the screen. It was an email from Internal Affairs. A formal notice that the investigation into Rachel Gibbs had begun was attached. There were initial statements from witnesses, including one officer who had already reached out anonymously to corroborate Michael's account. But there was more. A second email from an anonymous source hinted at past complaints against Gibbs, complaints that had been quietly dismissed over the years. Michael's heart raced. This was exactly what he needed to build his case. He forwarded the emails to his lawyer. His resolve hardening. Gibbs wasn't just going to walk away from this. He would make sure that back at the station Rachel Gibbs was already on the offensive. She sat in the office of her union representative, her jaw clenched as they discussed the situation. "You've got options," the representative said, flipping through a thick folder of paperwork. "You can claim that Harper's actions are personal, make it about bias, and say he's using his son's incident to target you unfairly." Rachel smirked, though it felt hollow. "Do you think anyone's going to buy that?" "It doesn't matter if they buy it," the representative replied with a shrug. "What matters is planting the idea, making Harper look like the one with an agenda, and casting doubt on his motives." Rachel nodded slowly, the gears turning in her mind. It was a dirty tactic, but if it meant saving her career, she was willing to use it. She stood up, straightening her uniform. Do it whatever it takes. As the day wore on, tensions at the precinct continued to rise. Michael could feel the walls closing in as whispers spread through the department. Gibbs was playing dirty, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the pressure escalated. That evening, as Michael sat on the porch with Daniel beside him, the boy finally spoke. "Are you going to stop her, Daddy?" Michael looked down at his son, his heart aching at the fear in the boy's voice. He wrapped an arm around Daniel's small shoulders. "I'm going to try, buddy, I promise." Daniel looked up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. "What if they don't listen?" Michael sighed, pulling his son closer. "Then we made them listen." The boy nodded quietly, resting his head against his father's side. Michael stared out into the darkening sky. His resolve burned brighter than ever. The battle had only just begun, and Michael Harper was ready to fight for his son, for justice, and for every child who had ever been treated unfairly. The following morning, Michael Harper walked into the precinct, his mind buzzing with thoughts of the investigation. He had spent the night reviewing witness statements and gathering evidence to strengthen his case against Rachel Gibbs. The revelations about her history of misconduct had only fueled his determination to see the process through. Yet every step forward felt like wading deeper into treacherous waters inside the precinct. Tension was palpable. Officers who once greeted him warmly now averted their gazes. The pressure from Gibbs's allies was mounting, and whispers of the investigation had spread through the ranks like wildfire as Michael headed toward his office. A familiar voice called out, "Harper!" He turned to see Detective Simmons leaning against a doorway, a concerned look on his face. A word Michael gave a curt nod and followed Simmons into an empty conference room. Simmons shut the door behind them, then turned, folding his arms. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, man. I'm aware," Michael replied coolly. Crossing his arms, Simmons exhaled through his nose, as if weighing his next words carefully. "They're coming at you from every angle. Mike Gibbs is claiming you're targeting her personally, and says this whole investigation is a vendetta because she disciplined some of your officers." Michael's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to stay calm. "She's lying, this isn't personal, she's covering for what she did." "I know," Simmons muttered, "but the department's trying to spin it her way. They're digging for anything they can use against you." Michael leaned back, his expression hardening. "Let them dig. I've got the truth on my side." Simmons gave a small, humorless chuckle. "The truth doesn't always matter." "Mike, you know that better than anyone." At home, the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Angela sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, watching the news coverage. Reporters speculated on the investigation, twisting the narrative in ways that made Michael seem like a man on a personal crusade against Gibbs. Angela sighed deeply as she muted the television, glancing toward the living room where Daniel played quietly with his toys. The boy's usual energy and joy were still missing, replaced by a caution that hadn't been there before the incident. When Michael returned home that evening, Angela met him at the door, worry etched across her face. "They're saying you're biased," Michael said, his voice heavy with concern. "They're trying to make it look like you're doing this out of revenge." Michael shrugged off his coat and tossed it over a chair. "They can say whatever they want. I'm not backing down." Angela's eyes softened as she stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "I just don't want you to lose yourself in this, Michael. You've been through so much already." He gave her a tired smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm doing this for Daniel, for all the kids who get treated like this." Angela nodded, though the worry in her eyes didn't fade. "Just be careful, okay?" "I will," he promised. The next day, Michael met with the department's internal affairs investigator, a sharp-aimed woman named Evelyn Hart. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and Michael felt a sliver of relief knowing she was assigned to the case. Hart laid out the latest findings. Several officers had come forward with complaints against Gibbs. Some were too afraid to testify, but a handful had agreed to give anonymous statements. Their stories painted a damning picture. Gibbs had a history of excessive force and abuse of power, all of which had been quietly swept under the rug. Until now. "It's worse than we thought," Hart said, flipping through her notes. "The department covered for her multiple times. They'll try to do it again if we don't act quickly." Michael nodded. "I'm not letting them get away with it this time." But just as things seemed to be turning in his favor, new challenges emerged. Gibbs's allies within the department were working behind the scenes, pressuring witnesses to recant their statements. Threats were made, and some officers backed out, fearing retaliation. Michael knew he needed a breakthrough through something that would force the department to take action, no matter how hard they tried to protect Gibbs. That breakthrough came unexpectedly when a former officer named Marcus Fletcher reached out. Marcus had left the force years ago after a falling out with Gibbs, and now he was willing to testify. "She ruined my career," Marcus told Michael during their meeting, "but I've got the receipts, emails, and reports. Everything they covered up is all yours if you're willing to fight." Michael's heart pounded as he took the files from Marcus, flipping through the damning evidence. This was exactly what he needed to push the investigation forward. The next few days were a whirlwind with Marcus's testimony and the mountain of evidence. Michael's case against Gibbs gained momentum. Hart scheduled a disciplinary hearing and the date was set. The department had no choice but to proceed, and Gibbs knew her time was running out in a last-ditch effort to save herself. Gibbs made a public statement accusing Michael of using his position to settle personal scores. She painted herself as a victim, claiming that she had only been doing her job. The day she encountered Daniel in the park, but the public wasn't buying it. The video footage spoke for itself, and more witnesses came forward, bolstering Michael's case. Social media exploded with support for Michael and Daniel, and protests outside the precinct grew louder, demanding accountability. As the day of the hearing approached, Michael knew the battle was far from over. Gibbs's allies were still working behind the scenes, trying to sway the outcome in her favor, but Michael was ready. He had the truth on his side, and this time there would be no hiding from it. The room was filled with tension as the disciplinary hearing commenced. A long mahogany table stretched across the front of the room, where a panel of senior officers and legal representatives sat, each with a stack of papers in front of them. The department's insignia hung on the wall, a stark reminder of the authority and scrutiny that filled the space. Michael Harper sat at one side of the room, his posture straight and calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Naomi Clark, whispered final preparations to him, but Michael's gaze remained focused on the opposing table. Rachel Gibbs sat across from him, dressed sharply in her uniform, projecting the image of a dutiful officer wrongfully accused. Her attorney, a slick talker named Gerald Foster, sat beside her, a smug smile playing at the corner of his lips. The hearing began with a chief's statement, setting the tone for what would be a long and grueling process. Both sides were given the opportunity to present their case, starting with Michael's testimony. Michael rose to his feet and took a deep breath, his gaze steady as he addressed the panel. "I stand here not just as a father," he began, "but as an officer committed to justice. What happened in the park that day was not an accident, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an abuse of power. Officer Gibbs's actions were reckless and unjustified, and they could have cost my son his safety or worse." His words were met with silence, the weight of his testimony settling over the room. He detailed the events of that day, from the moment he saw his son pinned beneath Thor to the confrontation that followed. "This is not about personal vendettas," Michael continued. "This is about holding ourselves accountable as officers. We cannot pick and choose when to follow the law and when to abuse it." The panel nodded solemnly, their expressions unreadable, but Michael could see their unease. They knew this case had become more than just an internal investigation. It was a public spectacle, and the department's reputation was on the line. When Michael finished his testimony, Naomi Clark presented the video evidence. The footage showed Daniel lying on the ground, terrified, with Thor snarling above him, while Gibbs stood by, unmoved. The panel watched in silence. The uncomfortable reality of the footage was undeniable. Next came the testimonies from witnesses. Some spoke anonymously, fearing retaliation, while others appeared in person to recount the events. The pattern of Gibbs's misconduct was clear. This wasn't the first time she had crossed the line, and unless action was taken, it wouldn't be the last. Gerald Foster leaned back in his chair as the panel turned to Gibbs. His confidence was palpable as he introduced her statement. Officer Gibbs has served this department honorably for years, Foster began smoothly. She's been on the front lines protecting our community. What happened in the park that day was an unfortunate misunderstanding. She acted out of caution, not malice. Gibbs straightened in her seat, her expression carefully neutral. I didn't mean to harm the boy, she said. I believed he was acting suspiciously, and I made a split-second decision to release Thor. It was never my intention to hurt anyone. Her words were carefully rehearsed, but they rang hollow. Michael clenched his fists beneath the table, his frustration simmering just below the surface. It was clear that Gibbs was trying to paint herself as the victim, a dedicated officer caught in an unfortunate situation. Foster continued his defense, attempting to cast doubt on Michael's motives. Captain Harper, he said, turning toward Michael with a calculated smile, is not just a concerned father. He is also the captain of this precinct, with a vested interest in seeing Officer Gibbs punished. We must ask ourselves, has personal bias influenced this investigation? The panel murmured among themselves, and Michael could feel the weight of Foster's words pressing down on him. He knew this tactic well. Turn the victim into the aggressor, shift the blame, and muddy the waters just enough to create doubt, just as the tension reached its peak. Naomi Clark stood. The defense wants to make this about Captain Harper's motives, she said calmly. But this case isn't about motives. It's about actions. Officer Gibbs released a police dog on a child without just cause. The evidence speaks for itself. She gestured toward the video playing on the screen. We're not here to speculate on Captain Harper's intentions. We're here to determine whether Officer Gibbs acted within the bounds of the law, and it's clear that she did not. The room fell silent, the weight of the evidence undeniable. Just as the panel was preparing to deliberate, when the door to the room creaked open and a man stepped inside. It was Marcus Fletcher, the former officer who had agreed to testify. All eyes turned to him as he walked toward the front of the room, his face set with determination. I have something to say, he announced, his voice steady. Michael exchanged a glance with Naomi, relief washing over him. Marcus's testimony was the final piece of the puzzle, a witness with first-hand knowledge of Gibbs's misconduct. I worked with Rachel Gibbs for years, Marcus began, his voice loud and clear, and I saw firsthand how she abused her power. This isn't the first time she's used excessive force, and unless something changes, it won't be the last. The panel listened intently as Marcus detailed several incidents, providing damning evidence of Gibbs's history of misconduct. The room buzzed with murmurs as his testimony unfolded, the tide of the hearing shifting in Michael's favor. When Marcus finished, he handed over the documents he had brought, emails, internal reports, and records that painted a troubling picture of Gibbs's career. The panel studied the evidence carefully, their expressions grave with the truth laid bare. The panel called a brief recess to deliberate. Michael sat silently at the table, his heart pounding in his chest. Naomi placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We've got this, she whispered. After what felt like an eternity, the panel returned. The lead officer cleared his throat and looked directly at Rachel Gibbs. After reviewing the evidence and considering all testimonies, he began. We have concluded that Officer Gibbs's actions were in clear violation of department policy. Effective immediately, Officer Gibbs is relieved of her duties. A collective breath seemed to escape the room as the decision was announced. Gibbs sat frozen in her chair, disbelief etched across her face. Oster leaned in to whisper something to her, but she didn't respond. Her career was over, and there was no escaping the consequences this time. Michael exhaled slowly, the weight of the battle finally lifting from his shoulders. He glanced toward Marcus and gave him a grateful nod. The fight had been long and exhausting, but justice had prevailed. As the room emptied, Michael stood and made his way toward the door, where Angela and Daniel waited. Daniel's face lit up as he saw his father, and Michael scooped him into his arms, holding him close. It's over, buddy, Michael whispered. We did it. The aftermath of the hearing rippled through the department like a shockwave. The official decision determined Rachel Gibbs had been met with mixed reactions. Some officers resented Michael Harper for what they saw as a betrayal of one of their own, while others quietly supported the outcome, relieved that someone had finally held Gibbs accountable. The tension between those two camps was thick, lingering in the hallways of the precinct. But for Michael, it was a different kind of weight that settled in his chest. The battle he had fought was over, yet the victory felt strangely hollow. There were no celebrations, no triumphs, just the quiet realization that doing the right thing didn't always feel like a win. The following week, Michael stood outside the precinct, watching as Rachel Gibbs walked across the parking lot. Her shoulders slumped, her once imposing figure now reduced to something smaller, almost insignificant. She was no longer in uniform, and the badge she had once worn with pride was now just a memory. Her face was drawn, the anger that had burned so brightly during the hearing replaced with a cold emptiness as she passed by. Their eyes met briefly. There were no words exchanged, but Michael could see the bitterness in her gaze. He had expected her to lash out, to throw one final barb his way, but instead she simply turned and continued walking, her figure disappearing down the street. Michael exhaled, the tension in his chest finally easing as he turned to head back inside. The door had barely closed behind him when he was greeted by a few of his colleagues. Some gave him nods of quiet respect. While others avoided his gaze altogether, he could sense the shift in how he was viewed, no longer just as their captain, but as a man who had exposed one of their own. It wasn't a comfortable position, but it was one he accepted. Later that day, Michael sat in his office, staring out of the window. The weight of everything he had been through, facing his own department, the public scrutiny and the fear for his son's safety, seemed to settle all at once, for the first time in weeks. He allowed himself to breathe, truly breathe, knowing that the immediate battle was behind him, but as he leaned back in his chair, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. The case against Gibbs had been won, but the larger battle, the one against the systemic issues that allowed officers like her to operate unchecked, was far from finished. Michael knew that this victory was just one step in a much longer journey. His position in the department and his ability to influence change from within gave him a platform, but it also made him a target. There would be more challenges ahead, and he had to be ready for them. At home, the tension that had plagued Michael's family had finally started to lift. Angela was in the kitchen preparing dinner, while Daniel played with his toys in the living room. The boys' laughter echoed through the house, something Michael hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity. As Michael stepped through the door, Daniel's face lit up. "Daddy!" he called, running toward his father with his arms outstretched. Michael scooped him up, holding him close as the boy giggled, the sound filling the room with warmth. "Did you have a good day, buddy?" Michael asked, his voice soft. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. "I played outside today. I wasn't scared." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's great, buddy. I'm so proud of you." Angela appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a towel. She gave Michael a knowing smile, her eyes filled with the kind of quiet relief that only came after enduring something so intense, so emotionally draining, and surviving it. "How was work?" she asked, though the question carried an unspoken acknowledgement of everything they had been through. "Quiet," Michael replied, setting Daniel down gently. "No more hearings, no more chaos, just normal." Angela chuckled, stepping forward to wrap her arms around him. "I like normal," she whispered against his chest. "Me too," he agreed, his arms encircling her for a moment. They stood in silence, savoring the peace that had eluded them for so long. After dinner, as the sun began to set, Michael took Daniel for a walk in the park, the same park where everything had started. The air was cool, the golden hues of sunset bathing the trees in warm light. Families were scattered across the grassy knolls, children playing, dogs running freely, and the sounds of laughter filled the air as they walked along the familiar path. Daniel's hand in his, Michael felt a sense of closure. The park no longer felt like a place of fear and tension. It was once again a place of peace, where his son could feel safe. Daniel paused by the hill where the incident had taken place, his eyes scanning the spot. Michael watched him carefully, wondering if the boy would be frightened or anxious, but instead Daniel smiled. "Look, Daddy, I can run," Daniel said, releasing his father's hand and sprinting down the grassy slope with the same joyful abandon he had before the incident. His laughter echoed through the park, and Michael couldn't help but smile. He stood there for a moment, watching his son run freely, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lift from his shoulders. It wasn't just a return to normal, it was a reclamation of everything they had lost during the ordeal. As Daniel ran back toward him, his face flushed with excitement, Michael knelt down and pulled his son into a tight embrace. "I love you, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you too, Daddy," Daniel replied, his arms wrapping around Michael's neck for the first time in what felt like forever. Michael Harper felt at peace. The battle was over, but the lessons would stay with him forever. He had fought for justice not just for his son, but for every child who deserved to grow up without fear. And though there were more battles ahead, Michael knew he had the strength, the courage, and the resolve to face them. Because he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his family, for his community, for justice. As they walked home together, the park fading behind them, Michael knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would face them head-on. Because now, more than ever, he understood the importance of standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against him, and for Daniel, for his family, and for every child who would grow up in a world that was just a little bit better because of his fight. It was all worth it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for the next video. There's so much more coming your way. And while you're here, check out some of our other videos. Don't miss out. Subscribe now, and we'll see you in the next one.